All right, today we're jumping into a story that's just incredible. It's about how a nation, with no army to speak of, but with an unbreakable will, managed to face down the most powerful empire on the planet. This is the story of India's long, long struggle for freedom. So let's just think about this for a second. How do you actually do that? How does a nation defeat a global empire without firing a shot? It seems impossible, right? But the answer, you'll see, wasn't about weapons at all. It was about a revolutionary idea and just this incredible, unwavering will to be free. And you gotta understand, this wasn't just a handful of leaders making speeches. This was a movement that came from the ground up. We're talking about people from all walks of life, all corners of society, uniting together. They were all driven by this one powerful idea. They wanted to rule themselves. So what was it they were pushing back against so hard? Well, to really get the resistance, you first have to understand the empire's strategy. And it was a pretty famous one. You've probably heard of it: divide and rule. Okay, so this was the absolute core of their playbook. The British knew, they knew, their biggest threat wasn't some rival army. It was a unified Indian people. So their strategy was less about military might and more about psychology. The idea was, if you can create cracks, exploit differences, and encourage dissent, well, then you can keep the population fragmented and a whole lot easier to control. And man, the effects of that strategy, they're still being felt today. And in 1905, they took this theory and put it into practice in a big, big way. It was called the Partition of Bengal. They literally drew a line on a map right through the province to separate areas with a Muslim majority from those with a Hindu majority. The goal? It was pretty blatant. Create a rift between the two communities. And by doing that, you weaken the growing nationalist movement right at its core.
But here's the thing, it backfired. Big time. Instead of creating division, it did the exact opposite. It sparked this massive, unified protest called the Swadeshi movement. People all over started boycotting British goods, burning foreign-made items, and going on strike. The economic hit was huge, and the message was crystal clear. You can't divide us. It was so effective, in fact, that the British actually had to reverse the decision and reunite Bengal in 1911. What a turn of events.
So, the Swadeshi movement was proof that people power could work. But the struggle was about to get a major upgrade. A new leader was on the scene, and he brought with him a philosophy of resistance that would, quite literally, change the world. And that, of course, was Mahatma Gandhi. So, in 1915, after spending years in South Africa honing his skills as a lawyer and an activist, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi came back to India. He didn't waste any time either. He stepped into a leadership role with the Indian National Congress, and he brought with him a totally fresh, totally new way of looking at the entire freedom struggle. He basically introduced two game-changing ideas. First, you have satyagraha. Think of it as truth force or nonviolent resistance, civil disobedience. And then you have Swaraj, which was the goal, self-rule or total independence. So the method was nonviolence, the goal was freedom. These were the new weapons for the movement. Now, this idea of nonviolence, it was about to face its most brutal test. What happens next is a moment that becomes an absolute turning point. It's an event that shocks the nation to its core and hardens its resolve like never before. The date is April 13th, 1919. In the city of Amritsar, thousands of people, men, women, and children, are gathered in a large walled garden. It's called Jallianwala Bagh, and they're there for a peaceful protest against some really oppressive new British laws. And then the unthinkable happens. British troops move in and block the only way out. There's no warning, no order to disperse. They just raise their rifles and open fire on the completely unarmed crowd. For 10 solid minutes, they just keep shooting until they run out of ammunition. Thousands were killed or injured. It was an absolute massacre. This event, the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, sent a shockwave across India, and frankly, across the world. For so many Indians, any last shred of hope for a fair compromise with the British, it was just gone. It was shattered. The conversation completely changed. It wasn't about getting a little more self-rule anymore. No. After this, the demand was for nothing less than complete and total independence. But you know, out of this horrific tragedy, the movement somehow grew even stronger. And Gandhi's method, satyagraha, was about to be put on the world stage in its most famous and honestly brilliant form. a simple, symbolic act of defiance that would challenge the full might of the British Empire. So, here was the situation. The British had a monopoly on salt. They taxed it heavily and made it illegal for any Indian to make or sell their own. Now think about it. Salt is something everyone needs, rich or poor. So in 1930, Gandhi picks this as his target. He leads a march, a 240-mile march to the sea. And when he gets there, he performs this simple act. He picks up a lump of salty mud and boils it to make salt, openly breaking the British law. And that single action was like a signal. It inspired millions of people across the country to start making their own salt, all of them defying the law together. And that's the genius of it, right? The Salt March was never really just about salt. It was about showing the world and the British that millions of people engaged in mass non-cooperation could literally bring the machinery of the empire to a grinding halt. It was an absolute masterstroke of political symbolism and civil disobedience. All right, so as the years roll by, the pressure keeps building. The calls for freedom get louder and louder, and it's all heading towards one final, decisive showdown. This was going to be the all-out demand for the British to just leave. So now it's August 1942. The world is deep into World War II. And in this moment of global chaos, Gandhi launches what he calls the Quit India movement. And his slogan for it? It was incredibly direct and powerful. Do or die. Now, he wasn't calling for violence. He was calling for a final, determined push, a willingness to sacrifice everything to achieve freedom, right then and there. As you can imagine, the British response was immediate and severe. They arrested all the top leaders, Gandhi, Nehru, Patel, the whole group, and threw them in prison. Protesters in the streets were met with extreme force. But it was too late. The spirit of the movement, you just couldn't break it at that point. It's also really important to remember that while Gandhi's nonviolent movement was the most prominent, it wasn't the only one. Not everyone was on board with that strategy. You had leaders like Subhash Chandra Bose, who believed that freedom had to be won on the battlefield. So he formed the Indian National Army, or INA, which actually fought the British militarily. It just goes to show you how complex this whole struggle was, with different leaders and different ideas all pushing towards the same goal. So you have all this pressure coming from different directions. The Quit India movement at home, Bose's army abroad, and of course, a world completely changed by World War II. A weakened Britain finally had no choice but to come to the negotiating table. Independence was, at last, on the horizon. But it was going to come at a terrible, devastating cost. Things started moving really fast then. The 1942 Quit India movement was the final push. 5 years later, in 1947, Britain agreed to grant independence. But their last act was to partition the country. Remember that divide and rule strategy from the beginning? Well, this was its tragic final chapter, splitting the subcontinent in two. And so, on August 15th, 1947, after decades upon decades of struggle and sacrifice, India was finally a free nation. Jawaharlal Nehru was sworn in as its first prime minister. It should have been a moment of pure joy, but it was overshadowed by the horrific violence and mass migration of the partition, which created the new nation of Pakistan. A bittersweet victory, to say the least. So that brings us back to where we started, really, with a question for you. When you look back at this incredible story, a story of nonviolent resistance, of brilliant strategic defiance, and of just immense human sacrifice, what lessons can we take from it? What can it teach modern movements that are fighting for change right now? Definitely something to think about. Thanks for listening.